Arkwright himself had been born in Preston. He wasn't born to a wealthy family. He was the youngest of 13, the son of a barber. They weren't affluent. Arkwright himself had no formal education, but he was a Lancashire man. He'd ended up in Derbyshire, but he always had a hankering to return to Lancashire. And he tried that in 1777 when he built a mill at a place called Birkacre, which is just outside Chorley in central Lancashire. Now, one of the great things about Derbyshire perhaps is that the people had a bit of a different attitude, whereas in Lancashire, I think as we've seen demonstrated quite recently with the Mayor of Manchester, we can be a bit stroppy, and that happened in Birkacre. And there was great exception to this new factory with machines which are going to do our job for us. We're quite happy doing the domestic industry, thanks. We don't want your machines. And Birkacre Mill was burnt down. That's not it. That's something totally different, but it's just as an example. Birkacre Mill was destroyed by a mob of machine breakers within 6 months of it opening. They went in about 2 o'clock, and before 4 they destroyed all the machinery. The great wheel set fire to the broken frames. I'd love to show a picture of that, but there aren't any. So I have used another one, really to demonstrate that it wasn't only at Birkacre that this was happening. This particular painting is depicting machine breakers in London on Blackfriars Bridge, where a steam-powered corn mill was destroyed by rioters in 1791. Again, it's that whole thing of a bit of resistance, strong resistance, to the inception of the factory age. We do hear a lot about Luddites. That's a term that a lot of people might have heard. It's probably just worth mentioning, this is pre-Luddite. The Luddites didn't become formed as a group, even though they weren't a group, but generally they weren't around per se as Luddites until about 1810, 1811. But they kind of probably built on this earlier groundswell of fear, resentment, apprehension to the implementation of factories. But it was something that couldn't be fought. It was happening, it's progress. The value of Arkwright Mill was, notwithstanding a few rioters, the value was seen widespread, and his patent or his idea was adopted across Lancashire, and numerous Arkwright type watermills were established from the 1780s onwards. Many of them small affairs, most of them remote rural locations, but we see an awful lot of them who are using Arkwright's machinery under patent. Just locally around Halton and Caton, we have 4 that were brought into production during this time. Low Mill in Caton, I'll show that in a second. That is probably, that's a really nice example, one of the early ones, 1784. Low Mill, confusingly, in Halton, followed a few years later, 1790. Willow Mill in Caton, 1790. And Forge Mill in Caton, about 1795. But further up Loomsdale Valley, we had water-powered Arkwright Mill in Hornby, another mill in Ray, and a lot more further south. Again, many occupying very remote locations. I can't really move on without showing at least a picture of Low Mill in Caton. It has been converted, I would say quite successfully actually, to apartments. It was converted some time ago, but it still retains that characteristic Arkwright type mill feel and look to it. It is a Grade 2 listed building, and it is, well, it's a splendid thing, there's no question. And it's really one of the rare survivors from that early period, although I should say that the original mill itself did burn down, and most of the mill as it survives today was rebuilt in the 1820s, I think. This drawing quite usefully shows a section through one of these Arkwright mills in Derbyshire. These mills are in a town called Belper, which was built by the Strutts, who were one of Arkwright's financial backers, very wealthy backers. They built themselves a mill built on his principle. But it just shows, I think quite usefully, how the power systems actually worked in one of these mills. So very similar to that silk mill we saw earlier, we've got a huge big central water wheel driving a primary power shaft, which in turn powers these vertical shafts from which are taken off the line shafts that drive the machinery inside. Again, at this date, they will have been largely timber, or all of timber, although we are seeing the introduction of metal cast iron gear wheels, so we do have that stage of progression. That's a big mill. Low Mill was a fairly sizable mill. Perhaps what was more typical of the area were these slightly smaller mills. And this is an example, not necessarily very close to here, but near Chipping, which is very remote in many respects. This is Kirk Mill, and to my mind, this is probably the best surviving example of a small-scale Arkwright type mill in Lancashire. It dates from 1785 and survived remarkably intact. It remained in use for cotton spinning until the 1860s and was used thereafter for producing chairs, and it stayed as a chair factory till the early 2000s, and has been recently bought with the vision of creating it into a boutique hotel, but the main emphasis is going to be keeping its historic character intact. But I just wanted to put that up really as a pretty good example of a small-scale water-powered Arkwright type mill. So the next big change we had, massive change in the industry, was the introduction of steam power. This was a major step forward for the industry. I put James Watt up there. James Watt steam power, very famous name, and yes, he did introduce some very key inventions in terms of steam power. He didn't invent it. Steam engines had been around for quite a while before James Watt. They were being successfully used by Newcomen in 1711, but mainly or purely for pumping water, mainly out of mines. The key thing that Watt introduced was the wheel. He got a steam engine to move a large wheel rather than just having the linear up and down motion that you required for a pump. Watt successfully converted that to turn a wheel, which in turn could be used to drive machinery. And that was the key invention, 1781. That led very rapidly to the steam-powered textile mill. Now the great thing about steam power is that we broke the shackle of having to be by a river. It was no longer necessary. You didn't need that flow of water. You needed a source of water for the steam engine to condense on. You needed water for the boilers to raise the steam for the engine, but it didn't have to be by a river. This in turn meant textile mills could be built in towns, and this is where we get the birth of the urban textile mill. This example, this is Murray's Mill and McConnell Kennedy's Mill in the Ancoats area of Manchester. McConnell Kennedy's Mill was built in 1797, Murray's Mill 1798, and this engraving, it was produced in 1829 I think, has been called one of the iconic images of the Industrial Revolution. I think there's some truth in that. It's certainly an image that a lot of people might be familiar with, but it captures that urban textile mill perfectly and captures a brand new type of urban landscape that really came to dominate much of Lancashire. Lancaster took a benefit of this, not to the extent of places like Manchester, Stockport, Bolton, the southern part of Lancashire, but we do see steam-powered mills more or less everywhere. In Lancaster, we have White Cross Mills, or did have White Cross Mills, which was built in 1802, and that's Lancaster's oldest cotton mill. Bits of it do survive, but in the top we can see it in its more or less in intact state from an aerial photo taken in the 1920s, largely reduced down to what it is today as a result of collapse and a couple of fires. And the image we have on the left is a load of dots on maps which just show the distribution of textile mills in Lancaster and its immediate vicinity, i.e. Halton and Halton. Not all of those dots are cotton mills, I should say that. There are a variety of different mills on that map, but it gives you some idea of the distribution of the textile industry, the factory-based textile industry, in the heart of Lancaster. And that would not have happened without steam power. It couldn't. There's no other way of powering it. Another big thing about steam is that it demanded changes to the design of the building, the design of the mills themselves. They had to house a steam engine. Steam engines also demanded a lot of cast iron, specially crafted cast iron, and specially founded mechanical parts. So we do see during this period a great boost in the structural engineering, if you like, as iron foundries turn their mind to creating different types of mechanical components and structural components for textile mills. Now, this is seen there's no better example, I don't think, than Ditherington Mill, which is down in Shrewsbury, not an area you normally associate with the textile industry. But this is probably one of the most, well, according to English Heritage, it is the most important industrial site in Britain. And I do get some satisfaction from the fact that it's associated with the flax industry, because it really brings home that flax was actually really quite important. So why do we go on about Ditherington Flax Mill? Well, this was built in 1797, and the key thing about it is that it is iron framed. It's the first iron frame building in the world, and as English Heritage say, or Historic England, sorry, I should say, it is the precursor to the modern skyscraper. This is where it all set off. Previously, in mills to this day, all the structural members, all the beams, etc., will have all been of timber, whereas Ditherington proved that you could actually do it in iron. One of the reasons that Ditherington Flax Mill was built is that the flax industry, flipping back to flax just for a minute if you'll bear with me, the flax industry had actually progressed whilst the cotton industry was progressing. And it had actually drawn on some of the innovations in the cotton industry. In particular, a spinning machine was being developed by a couple called John Kendrew and Thomas Porthouse. Now this machine, which was painted in 1787, was actually based on Arkwright's machine, on his water frame, and it allowed flax to be spun mechanically. Now inevitably this led to the factorisation of the entire flax process, and we do see a bit of a boom in the number of flax mills being built in the 1790s and the early 1800s, and we see these real centres, important centres developing, particularly in Scotland, North East Scotland, Leeds and Lancashire. These all emerged as areas for flax. In the borough of Lancaster, we've actually had, over time, there was actually 14 flax mills, or at least mills that were used for some period of life for flax production. And another 14 flax mills in Preston. Now the reason for this, in some respects, is our location. We're located on the west coast. We had access to shipping trade from the Baltic, bringing in the Russian flax, and also the Irish flax trade that was still there. We did have our homegrown flax, certainly, particularly in this area, flax was grown and that was used, but the amount that was used in these mills did depend upon imported sources. Quick map showing flax mills around Halton. Forgebank Mill, this was converted to flax, wasn't built specifically, but it was used for flax for a short period in 1825. Ball Lane Mill in Caton, about 1820, and Forge Mill in Caton, which was converted for the use of flax in about 1800. Associated with flax, effectively the linen industry, was another important industry which demanded mills in and around this area, particularly Lancaster, was sailcloth. Now, sailcloth had been produced in Lancaster after 1750. No coincidence, that coincides with the opening of the port of Lancaster. Several reasons there. One, we're getting the imported raw materials in, but two, with a port, we get a shipbuilding industry, and shipbuilding industry, well, ships demanded sails. So a ready-made market there for sailcloth. The earliest known sailcloth factory in Lancaster was on Moor Lane. That was opened, as far as we know, in 1775 by Dilworth and Morrison. Other factories followed rapidly after that, and there was numerous in Lancaster. John Kendall had a factory in Skirton, 1781. Factory opened on the corner of Oilcloth Lane and Henry Street in 1788. More factories on Moor Lane and Leonard's Gate, 1790s. And the trade increased rapidly, but it also died almost as rapidly as it rose. And by the 1820s, it was in steep decline. One of the reasons for that, there's a number of reasons, but the Napoleonic Wars didn't help. It was a double-edged sword, really, the Napoleonic Wars. In one respect, they created a boost for the industry in terms of increasing the demand, sailcloth for ships. But at the same time, Napoleonic fleet was causing a blockade, so Baltic supplies of flax were not getting into Lancaster. The image on the right is one of the Moor Lane mills, which did start off as a sailcloth factory. It was bought by Samuel Gregg & Co., one of the large firms of cotton spinners in the country. Numerous mills. They were responsible for Low Mill in Caton. Their main mill was actually Style, down in just near where Manchester Airport is today. Huge factory there. But they purchased Moor Lane Mill in 1825 and converted it to cotton. And that was the fate for many of the mills, textile mills, in the Lancaster region from the 1820s onward. Certainly most of the sailcloth factories went over to cotton. Some of the flax mills did. Some of the silk mills went over to cotton. Cotton became king. It's possibly worth very quickly having a look at some of the processes that were happening in a cotton mill. If I'm honest, I think this is just a thinly veiled excuse to show these really beautiful drawings that were produced by J.R. Barfoot in 1840. He produced a series of these lovely drawings that show the different processes in the cotton mill. So basically what we have in the top left is the first stage, which is the willowing or blowing. Basically raw cotton bales are arriving. The first thing to do is to give them a good flail, open up the cotton bales, try and drive out any seeds or dirt or big objects, alien objects we don't want in there. Flails around, get rid of the rubbish. It's then ready to go top right into the lapping machine, which basically just creates a flat wad of cotton, which is ready to be fed into the third and one of the most important machines, the carding engines. As you all know, were introduced and invented by Richard Arkwright in 1785. They had improved a little bit by the 1840s, but basically cotton lap is fed into the machine. Inside there are a big rotating drum that is covered in sharp metal spikes, and that combs the cotton, gets all the fibres going in a single direction. It also helps to get rid of any last little bits of dirt, throws those out while it's in there, and it comes out the other end, churns out in the can in like a rope of cotton. And we can see the young girl there waiting for that cotton to be filled up with this rope of raw cotton that can then be carried over to the next stage in the process, which was called drawing. This was essentially the start of the spinning process, and it just takes that rope, that sliver of cotton, and just give it a little twist to start it off on the route to the spinners, which is shown here in the top left. That is the spinning department. Now, the machine there isn't one of Arkwright's water frames at all. This was a different type of spinning machine, a very important spinning machine called the Mioller, spinning mule, which spun a very fine thread, and it was certainly favoured by the finest spinners. Most of the Manchester spinners will have used the Mioller, and these are the ones that went into the most of the big steam-powered mills. You will notice in that top left corner there is a small child underneath the machine. Their job, their extremely dangerous job, was to sweep up all the little bits of fluff, keep the machines clean, take out the fluff, which should A, be reused, and B, reduces the fire risk, because this stuff is very flammable. Once the thread had been produced on the mules, it could be wound on to onto big reels, which were then taken over to the next stage in the process, which was weaving. So where we take the cotton yarn and we weave it in to whatever good is needed. Now, this is another key stage in the process. Here we have power looms. The weaving process had, by this stage, been mechanised. The first attempt to mechanise the weaving was in 1785 by a gentleman by the name of Cartwright. He was the Reverend Cartwright from Lancashire, who had no background in the textile industry at all, and how he came to work on a power loom is one of those mysteries of history. What we do know, however, is that his machine didn't work. It wasn't successful, not commercially anyway, but he had proved that it was, with some tweaking, it was possible. Now, it was finally achieved in about 1818. The first successful power loom was put into production, and it was adopted with alacrity thereafter. And that's shown there by Barthel. The final stage, which is something I haven't touched on at all, was the finishing side of the trade, which was a very important branch of the textile industry. Now, by finishing, I'm referring to dyeing, bleaching, and as shown there, calico printing, actually printing patterns onto the finished cloth. The introduction of the power loom necessitated some changes to the standard design of a textile mill. We needed new rooms to house looms. Looms are very heavy machines, but they also have this habit of vibrating quite wildly, and it was recognised at a very early stage that they were not suitable for anywhere other than the ground floor. So consequently, they were housed in their own, what became known as sheds, and specially designed sheds with a very distinctive, what is known as a north light roof, the sawtooth profile that people, I'm sure, will have seen. These are very clever design, and they're designed specifically to have the light come in from generally the north direction, but whatever direction, certainly no direction that will get direct sunlight, because what the operators, the machine operators, really needed was to have a very even light throughout the working day, so they could spot immediately where threads were broken, so they could fix them. And direct sunlight was a real problem, so that was to be avoided. So from the 1830s onwards, we see this new type of building being introduced, the North Light weaving shed. And these were often, at that period, appended to a spinning mill. And we end up with something that we know as what we call integrated mills, where we're integrating the spinning department in the multi-storey block with the weaving department in the single-storey shed. This is an example from near Chorley, one I particularly like, Abbey Mill it's called, in a small settlement called Abbey Village. In the bottom left photograph, the aerial photograph, you can see we've got the big mill, and then in the back you can see just a row of cottages. That's it, that's all there is in Abbey Village. It really is a proper factory colony, and I think, to my mind, it's one of the best examples of a factory settlement that still survives in Lancashire, even though it's quite late. It's 1840 that mill was built, around 1840. and it's quite a spectacular area, conservation area, and that mill is now Grade 2 listed building. Integrated mills we can see elsewhere. I've just picked out an aerial photograph here from Historic England's wonderful website, Britain from Above. If you haven't looked at it, do so. It's fantastic. A series of aerial photographs from all across Britain, and it's a really useful resource. Most are taken in the late 20s, early 1930s, and it does give you a great snapshot of industrial towns prior to the Second World War and later clearance. So there we have central Lancaster. You should be able to make out Dalton Square right in the very centre. The reason I've put it up is that we have Moor Lane mills in the background. Some of those mills, people who know Lancaster may recognise the actual multi-storey blocks that are still there. But you can see there the sheds of the North Light roofs from the weaving sheds that were quite expansive across that part of town at one time. But all of those have since been cleared. That is one of the problems of weaving sheds. They are quite difficult to find a new use for. So those are integrated mills. This was great. These were very popular from the 1840s, 1850s. But in the second half of the 19th century, the different branches of the industry started to become increasingly specialised, and firms began to just do spinning or just do weaving. And again, this is when we see different types of landscapes, I suppose, or townscapes emerging. Up in the top right, we have what many people might consider as the typical cotton mill. And this certainly was the typical cotton mill for the Edwardian period. That's Tollcloth Mill in Preston, north edge of Preston. She was built in 1910, I think. But this really was the zenith of the art of textile factories. They did not become any bigger than this. And I think it's quite interesting to compare Tollcloth Mill there on the top right with the 1785 Kirk Mill in Chipping. You could fit that in a couple of bays of Tollcloth Mill. You know, I think what I'm trying to demonstrate here is the vast increase in the scale of production that was going on in the cotton industry through the 19th century. That bottom image is just a view of one of the floors in Tollcloth Mill, which at one time will have been filled full of spinning machinery. And on that floor alone, there will have been 10 times more spindles than in the entirety of Kirk Mill. So what we end up with is different types of textile townscapes. Spinning mills tend to dominate the southeastern part of Lancashire, Manchester, Stockport, Bolton, Bury, to a degree Blackburn, but not so much. It's very much the southeastern part of the country. Weaving became specialised in the northeastern part of the county, centred on Burnley, the great weaving capital of the world, seen here in the 1930s. And you can see right across there the North Light sheds, more or less everywhere. This was the weaving capital. There used to be a saying in Burnley whereby they would weave for the home market before breakfast, and then the rest of the day they were weaving for the world. And that was pretty accurate. Burnley by this time was producing 70% of the world's cotton goods. Well, North East Lancashire was producing 70% of woven cotton goods for the world. And it's a very distinctive townscape that we don't see anywhere else in the world to that extent, that density of North Light sheds. Many of those have gone. The best surviving example is Queen Street Mill. Some of you may have heard of that. This is outside Burnley, a place called Halton. It's built in the 1890s, and it is the last surviving steam-powered weaving mill that still houses its original Lancashire looms. It's the only one in the world that still survives. It's a Grade 1 listed building now. It is a museum. There are some issues with ownership at the moment, But to all intents and purposes, it does survive virtually intact. And that photograph on the left is an aerial view across Halside, which I particularly like. Got Queen Street Mill in the centre. On the right is its neighbour, King Mill. And then there's a housing development, which was sadly permitted in the 1980s, which occupies the site of a third mill, which is Primrose Mill. But if you can imagine another weaving mill there, you have this classic industrial settlement, Lancashire industrial settlement, that was purpose built effectively to serve those weaving mills. It's quite late at Halside. There was very little there prior to that. Another textile industry that has to be mentioned in the context of Lancaster is oilcloth. And this was a very particular type of industry. Now, why Lancaster? Why did it come here? Well, we've talked about the spinning mills that really gravitated to the southeastern part of Lancashire. We didn't really get those super mills, as I might call them, north of Preston. They didn't come this far. We're out. Lancaster region is out of that bracket. The weaving mills over to Burnley, northeast Lancashire, again, it didn't really come to this part, the Lancaster part of Lancashire. But Lancaster still survived as a textile producing area because it diversified. We still had silk. There was some flax going on, but other industries came on. We had sailcloth, and then from the 1850s we had oilcloth. And Lancaster was a very important centre of it. Oilcloth, or also known as American cloth, was effectively a very thick cotton cloth or even linen cloth that was soaked in linseed oil to make it waterproof. St George's Works begun as an oilcloth works in the 1850s, mid-1850s, and became one, I think it was one of the largest in the world of its time. It was certainly a very important oilcloth works. At its greatest extent, it covered more than 15 acres, which is a substantial size for one single factory. Most of the extent is shown in that aerial photograph, which is taken in the late 1980s now. And then below is a rather sad photograph of its final days in 2012, all sad and forlorn and in a very poor condition. Won't be surprised to hear that's more recently been demolished. That's on St George's Quay, undoubtedly taking advantage of not so much the port, which the port itself had been superseded by that time by Glasson Dock, but there was a good link with a single track railway that came from Glasson Dock right the way down to St George's Quay. So we still have that connection with a direct port. Further up the quay was another really important factory, which was essentially a branch of oilcloth, which was linoleum. Linoleum itself was invented in 1855 and it was used largely as a floor covering. But it's the same basic principle in that it takes a textile material and covers it with or bakes on linseed oil. In Lancaster, further up St George's Quay from St George's Works, we had the loom mills operated by James Williamson, where he bought up a defunct shipyard in 1873 and built this works. Initially it was built for the production of oilcloth, but soon went into the production of linoleum in 1887. And this, we thought St George's Works was big. It was nothing compared to loom mills, which covered a phenomenal 60 acres by the time it was completed. 4 separate big mill blocks, 5 separate boiler houses, dye house, colour department, warehouses, mechanics shops, caulking sheds, a vast array of stores, all on the quay, all now gone. And this is probably the point I just want to make to wrap up, is where's it all gone? This is a real challenge as we do enter this post-industrial age that we find ourselves in. And textiles are no longer produced in Lancaster. Some are produced in the southern part of the county, in what is now known as Greater Manchester. We do have some textile firms going on. There is some spinning, very limited, but some. There is some printing going on. But in the northern part of the county, textiles are no longer produced. And the buildings are increasingly becoming a threatened resource. And I say resource because I do consider these buildings as what we would call heritage assets. I said before, you know, I'm an archaeologist. People say, what's the best thing you've ever found? And I say without joking, you know, oh, water wheel pit from an Arkwright mill. You know, I do genuinely mean that, because to me, one of the most important reminders we have of our important past is represented by textile mills and their surviving buildings, but they are under great threat. The picture at the bottom right is it kind of makes me smile a little bit. It's something I saw attached to the fence that is surrounding the photograph on the top right. That was part of the vine mills in Accrington during demolition. I quite like the photograph because, apart from the fact it's sad seeing another textile mill go, it gives you this vertical section through the mill, which is quite interesting. But on the fence outside that, it said danger, demolition. Underneath, heritage, demolition. And I think that's so ironic. I don't think they actually mean, oh no, we are demolishing your heritage. It does actually mean that's the name of the company. But to me, it was kind of ironic. Some other mills that have gone very recently. The one on the bottom right was Bamber Bridge Mill, which was, as far as I can tell, that was the very last of what I call the super mills to be built in the modern county of Lancashire. It was built in 1907. In a sad state, it's a very sad state. After a very unsuccessful application to have it listed, it was demolished quite recently. It's now a housing estate. Similarly, the mill above is a weaving mill, or was a weaving mill in Blackburn. It was Garden Street Mill. And at that time, that was probably the earliest surviving North Light weaving sheds in the county. They were built in the late 1840s. But that again is one that has gone. I must come across as a bit of an anorak with mills. Oh, there's a photograph of a mill. Oh, there's another photograph of a mill I took a long time ago. One of the reasons for that is that back in 2008, when I worked for Oxford Archaeology North, we worked with English Heritage and Lancashire County Council to carry out an audit of Lancashire mills. Because at that time, there was no idea how many mills there were in the county. It wasn't actually known how many mills had actually ever been built. It was an unknown result. It had never been quantified. And we certainly don't know how many survived. And if we don't have those numbers, it's very difficult for local planning authorities, when they're looking at a planning application that says, I want to demolish this mill. A planning authority has to make a rational decision. And if they haven't got the information to make that decision, it's difficult. So that was one of the reasons behind this audit. Anyway, we carried out a survey between 2008 and 2011. It's the best job I've ever had. I got paid to ride a motorcycle around the county taking photographs of textile mills. Superb. And we ended up with a sum total of just over 1,600 textile manufacturing sites in the county. Now, they're shown on that map. You won't be able to read, because it's virtually impossible on the right, but there's an awful lot of dots which show the location of where there had been or there were mills. That's the total number of mills. And other associated buildings, and there's the trick really. They are not just cotton mills. That includes flax mills, silk mills, jute mills, although I think we only have one, I think, worsted mills, dye works, print works. But we also included ironworks that were built specifically to produce machinery for the textile industry. So it's all part of the textile industry. And that basically shows the distribution of where these sites were. As you can see from that, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the great focus of that is in the southeastern parts of the county, around Burnley, Nelson, Briarfield, Colne, Blackburn, Preston. But we do have this concentration up in Lancaster and heading off through Caden. So one of the key things was how many of these sites actually survive. Well, it's shown a little bit more clear on that map, where again we've got all the dots again, but on that it's impossible to show it at a scale without having a very large screen. But essentially the yellow dots are the sites of mills, associated textile manufacturing sites, that have been demolished. And the surviving ones are shown by the red dots. So out of that 1,661 sites that we identify from map-based sources, historical documents, newspapers, trade directories, the full gamut of sources we looked at, only 540 actually survived. And when I say survived, I mean survived to any extent. And in many cases, we might be looking at a mere fragment of what was the original full textile mill. So what it was very evident from this study is that the remains of the textile industry that was so important to this part of the world was being heavily eroded and was on the verge of loss. This quantifies it a little bit better, or more easily perhaps. Well, we've got standing mills shown in the blue, which is divided down by borough across the Lancashire boroughs. So we can see really places like Rossendale and Blackburn with Darwen have sustained a great amount of clearance and demolition of some of their textile mills, and really the percentage that are left are 30 odd, sometimes less than that, 20% of what was there originally. That's what we've got now. Subsequent to this study, we did, whilst at University of Salford, we did a very similar study for Greater Manchester, and the statistics there worked out more or less the same in terms of the actual survival. Now, since then, all this information has been fed back to Historic England, who've made great advances on looking at textile mills and trying to find ways to get them repurposed for new uses without the demolition, and making it easier, or trying to make it easier for would-be developers to take on some of these sites to actually reuse the historic fabric. And it can be done with great success. This is quite an old example, but one from Burnley, which was Victoria Mill, right in the heart of the Weavers' Triangle, this key area of Burnley where all the weaving mills were. You can see Victoria Mill in 2010. It was a derelict, dangerous shell of what was formerly a quite impressive integrated mill, spinning and weaving from the 1840s. In many places that would have been demolished. The Burnley Council took the view that it was worth investing the money to find a new purpose for it, and it was converted very successfully to a new university technical college. And it can be done, it can be achieved. And that was really a flagship, became a flagship for the wider regeneration of that area. There are numerous other examples that could be put up. It's very, very refreshing to be standing in a part of Halton Mill that is still standing. It's actually been put to very useful purpose, non-textile related, but it's still in good use and it's in good hands. And I hope that we will be able to see this sort of thing with other mills around the county. I've nothing else to say. Thank you for listening. And I hope that wasn't too random.